Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of September. Today we're covering events that have unfolded over the past 4 to 5 days. Since school started, I've been a bit on a hiatus, but now we're back and we're going to do a comprehensive summary of events, starting with the border region between Dnipro, Zaporozhye, and Donetsk. As we always do, there was a really deep Russian advance in recent days, which essentially manifested a lot of the talking points we've been focusing on at the beginning of videos. We'll also look at the Orikhiv sector in Zaporozhye. We'll zoom in on the area south of Pokrovsk, east of Myrnohrad, east of Novoselivka, north of Liman, and western Kupyansk to finish off today's video. There is a lot of content to cover, but of course, I want to begin by looking at the Russian capture of the village of Novoselivka, a really important advance that created a dagger-like shape. And you can see over here that in total, with the two polygons that I've marked in yellow, indicating Russian advances since the last video, they've been able to take over 11.6 and over here 9.21 square kilometers of territory, respectively. So not a trivial amount. The Russian forces, first of all, were able to consolidate control over this pocket of Ukrainian resistance north of the village of Komishuvaka, wherein you had some Ukrainian vestiges, very small quantities of them, trying to hold out within this line of trenches and Dragon's Teeth, and also some anti-tank ditches that are near the border over here between Donetsk and Dnipro. You could see it over here. So due to the presence of Russian forces from the 57th Brigade, for instance, in Komishuvaka, and then from the 36th and 336th Brigades in Malivka, there was simply no feasibility, no ability for the Ukrainians to hold on and create a solid stabilization point over here. So they've withdrawn towards Ternova, and there's actually a possibility I've seen based on some reports, and this is not verified yet, but there is a possibility that the Russian forces have already been able to reach Ternova and that it's in a gray zone right now and in a state of limbo, meaning that this outstretched location over here, which is also partially based out of a horizontal trench line, but more so just open fields and tree lines, this area may also be within, I suppose, the Russian field of vision and may have already been overrun. That's not yet clear right now, but we should keep an eye out for developments over there. Now, what we know for sure is that the Russian forces were able to develop their initial salient that started off with Malivka and then from there branched out to Verona. And now they've been able to arrive and take over the village of Novoselivka in its entirety. Some reports, actually, including from the Ukrainian side, claim that the Russians were able to overrun Horoshi as well, and that Sosnivka is partially in the gray zone, although for now, I'm going to withhold any sort of final judgment because there isn't enough solid proof through geolocations. But we do have a lot of geolocations from Novoselivka due to a video compilation released by the Russian side today of the course of the assault. So there was intense artillery, MLRS preparations, which included a lot of strikes on Ukrainian troop accumulations in the area north of the village and also to the west, because you do have a lot of Ukrainian forces gathered inside the forested patches where it's much more difficult to spot them and target them either way. And then from there, during the course of a battle, they may branch out and try to engage in frontline activities whenever the Russians approach. But either they're in basements in Novoselivka or they're hiding a bit to the north or west within the forested patches. And so that's where the Russian focus really was centered on. And we also saw that 10 units of equipment were destroyed. So the Russian side did publish footage of the RPG strikes on those vehicles. And then from there, they just stormed the village. Due to its small surface area, when you do send in a large convoy, and we're not talking about in a mechanized sense, I'm just talking about an influx of soldiers, doing so in such a quick succession makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians in this location, wherein they have a very small garrison, to rapidly respond, especially given the geographic dynamics over here, because Novoselivka is on the eastern side of the Vavcha River. It's also to the south of it in certain locations, and also to the south of the Kupyansk River. So it is in an area that is rather isolated. The capture was done by the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade, and so they cleared 120 houses within this village, and they claimed to have destroyed 2 companies worth of manpower, which again I doubt, but just for the sake of argument, the company within the Ukrainian context and also some NATO countries will be with between 60 to 200 soldiers. So you're looking at 120 to 400, and of course the word destroyed is ambiguous and would include killed or wounded. But either way, what we know for sure now is that the direct connectivity on the eastern bank, or see the southern bank of the Vavcha River, has been cut off between an area like Sichneve, Alexandrorad, and then also as well Tolstoy, Zeleny High, Andrivka, Kovtsove. All of those areas to the north of the Vavcha River no longer have a direct line of communication with the Ukrainian forces defending in Khoroshi, which may have been taken over, but let's just entertain that possibility that it still is partially under their control. Moreover, you have Sosnivka, Chernove, Berezhove, and a whole host of other villages that are running along this second line of defense that's supposed to begin in southern Dnipro and then sort of move southwestwards into Zaporozhye itself. And so now the streamlined connectivity between the entire Ukrainian front line over here is hampered. And this will give the Russians an opportunity to balkanize certain villages and certain fields that previously they were unable to assault head on. So Sichneve would be an example of an area where the Ukrainians held out. At this point, it's not going to be feasible to continue resisting in this location because it is so disconnected from the main Ukrainian bases, say in Veliki Mykhailivka or in Havrolivka to the north. And now with all the rivers and the Russian envelopment that is forming right now, it's going to be very difficult for even the Ukrainians in Alexandrorad to continue retaining control over their forward positions, meaning there is a possibility for the Russians to coalesce the front line running along the Vavcha River, at least over here. But then moving southwestwards, there are a lot of possibilities to even further deepen the extent of the Russian advance. But it all begins by securing control of Sosnivka. That would be an important objective for the Russian side because it would give them the needed tools to take advantage of this paved road and advance southwards and compromise an area like Berezhove. And that could be done in tandem with frontal assaults that we're already seeing right now in the direction of Chernove, of course. Looking at the distances that the Russians over here were able to embark upon, they advanced 3.5 kilometers westwards, north of Kumchuvaka, and then they advanced to Novoselivka. If we're looking at diagonally, it's about 7.6 kilometers northwestwards, as I said. So again, the Ukrainians from the 110th Mechanized Brigade or the 225th Assault Regiment, they are currently on the back foot. And due to the dynamics over here with the poor logistics, not many roads, the roads over here, if they do exist, they're poor and they have to cross over several bodies of water. And the area is also rural, so connecting between one place to another and having a large garrison placed over there is not always possible. And so for all those reasons, this is an area that's perfect for Russian exploitation, especially when there is a bit of a deficiency when it comes to the necessary amount of forces deployed to this particular area. And so that's just a cacophony of factors that allows the Russians to conduct such an advance. And the momentum is already there for continued advances along similar attack vectors. So just keep an eye out for this region. It's going to be very important within that context. But let's move on to this area over here, just to the north of Orikhiv. 1.87 square kilometers of territory captured. On August 31st, the 42nd Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto Russian forces in this tree line near the Dnipro border. And so just shaving off, I should say, the final remnants of Ukrainian possessions to the east of the border with Dnipro. So a lot of these final anti-tank ditches and trenches that were built along the border are now being taken over, along with their extended tree lines that sort of run perpendicular to these defenses. And the final major stronghold that is heavily concentrated and fortified would be the one over here in the northwestern corner of Dnipro over here near Moravka. So that's another one of those local targets. But again, all with the intention of creating the necessary conditions for an eventual all-out assault towards Novopavlivka, although it's not happening because there is a rather sizable Ukrainian garrison ensuring that it would not be feasible. And the same thing with the drone crews that ensure that any sort of mechanized assault through 6-7 kilometers of open fields would be met with a harsh response. Now, over here with the situation in Pokrovsk, we do have some Russian sources talking about a slight expansion when it comes to Russian activity in the city, including advances through the Kolonivka microdistrict, arriving near the high-rise apartment complexes. So that's a possibility, along with some clashes right now in between Novoukrayinka and Chernishny. And these attacks, these forward Russian operations are not being conducted by DRGs, at least not the same sorts of DRGs that were sent in during late July, early August, wherein they were, in these small individual groups and for weeks upon weeks had no way of physically connecting with the rest of their headquarters. So in this case, the advances by the Russians are far more concentrated, but they're also smaller and the pace is far slower as well. But again, keep an eye out for this region. It's an area where the Scala regiment is now operating, although they've had forays in numerous other locations that we'll get to throughout the course of this video, actually. And so over here, let's look at Myrnohrad because we do have a bit of a back and forth that unfolded, and I was meaning to talk about it, but I never got the chance to upload a video. But the Ukrainian forces around late August and then really 1st of September, 2nd of September, released a slow footage of flag raises and troops walking around areas in southern Novoselivka. So this became a new vector for Ukrainian counterattacks. The Ukrainians, they likely attacked from the western direction, so they organized their assault from Myrnohrad, and then from there were able to seep themselves into some of these houses or basements or whatever other structure is in these locations, and use that as a building block to continue advancing northwards until the local school and some of the larger buildings, and getting pretty close actually to the T0504 highway, which is the key road used for mechanized assaults, and we'll get to that in a moment, but also just for transport of equipment. And Novoselivka is a proper location for that sort of logistics treatment and logistics movement, but because it is so close to the line of contact, it's not possible. In either case, though, we did have geolocated proof of the Ukrainians counterattacking over here, and I'll show you guys the extent of that counterattack during its zenith. It's all within the yellow polygon over here, but you can see how it amounts to somewhere in the ballpark of 1.5 square kilometers of territory. So this region has fallen back into Russian hands due to the efforts of, in part, the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, but in general, reserves that were called up from the 51st Combined Arms Army. They were heavily involved in stabilizing the front line when the Ukrainians had made it to Mirny and nearly Myrnohrad. And now they're in the process of just solidifying control over everything that's running along the Kazany-Turets River, because this river valley does leave certain areas prone to being gray zones because it's simply not possible to build up a solid position over there without crossing over first and gaining control over additional territory through a tenuous route. But what I want to get to over here with Myrnohrad is that throughout the month of September, and I would say it started around the 1st and perhaps even in the few days before August was over, the Russian side was able to capture 4.5 square kilometers of territory, and this is pretty close to arriving at Myrnohrad directly. So looking at the horizontal advance, it's probably around 2.8 kilometers westwards, and so the main attack vectors would be along this paved road that then branches out westwards and crosses over the entire defense line built around the perimeter of Myrnohrad. We have this video over here from September 3rd of Russian armored vehicle that was targeted near vent shaft number 3. So that would be this particular location over here. And it's the vent shaft associated with the Stakhanov mine. The Stakhanov mine is this famous industrial facility currently contested, but you can see how it's supposed to be northeast of Myrnohrad over here. And so there are a couple of other ventilation shafts. Here there's a government office and also a substation, I believe. So this is a location where some Russian sources alleged to have been able to secure control, but nothing too concrete just yet. It appears as if, in this case, the Russian side was able to, first of all, reverse the course of the fighting in Novoselivka, because the entire goal of the operation is to just send in forces to seep in and then redirect Russian attention away from other locations and their own offensive activities. So over here, the Russians first dealt with those forces because they have presented the possibility of hindering Russian logistics of the front line. So now that they've been able to do that, they took advantage of the same routes and, I suppose, the same level of momentum to advance further southwestwards and run along this particular paved roads and get pretty close to the confines and the outer perimeter of Myrnohrad, only about 1.3 kilometers away at this point. And in the process, also capture a lot of forested patches like you see over here and some of this nearby pond region. So you can see how, interestingly, this entire Russian assault did bypass the Ukrainian bulge that is currently forming into the outskirts of Mikhailivka. So it appears as if this is a lower intensity part of the front line. There are far less Russian troop deployments to an area like Myrnohrad, which also makes it prone to counterattacks by the Ukrainians, but they're not necessarily fielding their most elite forces in this southeastern ring of Myrnohrad anyway. It's largely National Guard forces, unless there's some sort of special assault that needs to be repelled, which requires specialty from another units, which is actually what we want to look at over here, because in recent weeks we have discussed the advances, or not advances, but just rotation of forces and the beefing up of the Russian garrison in the Pokrovsk Dobropolye region. So the 155th and 40th Marine brigades have both already been deployed or are in the process of being deployed to this part of the front line. So you can see their logos over here on the map. So they're operating in this location, and at least in the case of the 155th, they've already organized a mechanized assault with the intention of breaking through into Myrnohrad in a similar fashion to what we saw over here, because in this case, there was an armored vehicle. There were two of them, at least, that I saw in the video, and one of them was destroyed due to either FPVs or a combination of that in mines. I don't remember exactly. But you could imagine that this region to the east of Myrnohrad would be dense in minefields due to the fact that it is simply no man's land and there aren't many static defenses over there. And so, based on that proof, we can infer that the Russian forces are pretty close to Myrnohrad itself, but not enough to actually break through the outer confines. So I believe it was the 155th Brigade that organized this convoy, likely from Cheratina, because Cheratina is over here. It's a very important logistics hub. And from there, advanced along the road to Pokrovsk. And then they were supposed to take this sort of rightwards turn to the north in this case, but that was stopped in its tracks by the 79th Air Assault Brigade and by the Ivan Franko group. So that unit is one that I couldn't find the logo for, but they are now operating in tandem with some of the larger elements, and they have experience when it comes to drone warfare, of course. And so they stopped, I believe it was 7 Russian vehicles in their tracks before they were even able to arrive at the line of contact, which is something that's happened less and less over the past year because the Russians have been reducing the footprint of their armored vehicles and armored assaults. The last major one that happened before all of these recent developments was in April or in March of 2025, when we saw those assault operations occurring in the direction of the border with Dnipro. So now we're seeing that as the Russians find an opportunity to actually deploy the tanks and deploy the armored vehicles without having them destroyed on site, and actually being able to achieve something tactically significant, that's the best opportunity for when to actually utilize armored vehicles to achieve any sort of local successes. But in any case, right now what's going on is the Russians are trying to move on from Novoselivka and deny the Ukrainians the ability to drag up the fighting over there and relegate it elsewhere. And now they're trying to just establish a forward base through which they can at least be on parity with some parts of Myrnohrad, especially the north, where it's a bit lower lying. And some locations, the east is actually on some higher elevation. There are a couple of ridges over here. So it's a location that can be used to get a pretty good understanding of it, at the very least, the movement in between Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. And so let's look a bit to the north over here, because we do have adjustments. I made some adjustments to the map based on Ukrainian counterattacks, and this is being a bit conservative in my estimate, by the way. But what we saw over here is that the Ukrainians sent the DRGs, not in any sort of massive degree, but they did send in some DRGs across the Russian line, and they deceived them or evaded them, and were then able to reestablish control over locations for temporary periods of time, or were able to at least try to disrupt the logistics of the Russian side, because that would be the objective of a proper DRG over here, to arrive at Boykivka for the Rivka, or even better, Novoselivka, and just completely shut off any sort of ability to take advantage of logistics. And so what we saw over here is, actually, we saw 2 videos. So one is from Boykivka. A Ukrainian soldier from Skala, from the 425th Skala Regiment, deceived 2 Russian soldiers. They thought that he was a fellow fighter from the same side, and I would assume that's due to variations in the uniforms. So there's not one acceptable uniform for either side. There's a lot of customization, so that leads to confusion. But then eventually the Ukrainian soldier was able to kill them and ambush them pretty much in their own turf, the Russians, because Boykivka, for a while now, it's been pretty well established that it is under Russian control. And then over here in Fedorivka, we had this same sort of compilation from Scala where they showed 9 Russian POWs in total, and some of them were captured north of Fedorivka and were guided by the Ukrainians, and so that would be around here actually. So let's measure Nikhanorivka and then this location over here where we did see some activity by DRGs, and then also the Russian counter movements trying to just solidify control of the front line. And so it's only about 3.5 kilometers away. So it's not that far away at this point. And you look at the routes that were utilized by those DRGs, and they pretty much took advantage of the fact that a lot of the initial advances by the Russian side were conducted through open areas. And so now there's a bit of the reverse going on right now. There is an avoidance and a skepticism of some of the populated locations. And I say skepticism because there's a lack of, I suppose, universal understanding of whether it's beneficial or even going to be likely that these areas end up falling into Russian hands, or rather Ukrainian hands. But what I'm trying to say over here is that there is a pretty clear route southeast of Nikhanorivka, largely in this open area, and it's also to the west of Orikhiv, where there actually was room for a lot of these DRGs to move without being detected. And so that's the way in which it's been sort of exported elsewhere. And so just to clarify the situation over here to the west of the Kucher VR salient, the Ukrainians within the past couple of days, it's not been in one fell swoop. This is just a manifestation of some of the withdrawals by the Russian side as the base of over here, the salient continues to get narrower and narrower. So we can see over here that 14 square kilometers of territory captured, including most of Novoselivka, Ivanivka, and more remains of the Rozhny and Nikhanorivka. So those will be some of the locations that have just been taken over. And it is important because it ensures that there will be no rapid Russian assault or attempt to envelop Belitska, at least for the time being. You still have this exposed location to the south of Belitska, but there won't be any flanking as long as the Ukrainians from 12th Days Off National Guard or from the 4th National Guard Brigade Rubij. And there are a couple of other ones over here, like Da Vinci's Wolves, 1st Assault Regiment. As long as they're able to hold the line over here, it's going to reduce the pressure on Belitska and to a certain degree on Rudinska. Although with Rudinska, it's even more impressive just due to the fact that, there's a lot of frontal pressure in that particular location. Same thing with Chervony Liman and the local mine over here that the Russians were able to capture. But just to harp back on one final point, there are a lot of reinforcements being moved to this area. That's being done in part due to the fact that the Ukrainians have been able to stop the offensive activities in some locations like the city of Pokrovsk itself or in the Kucher VR salient. And then from there, are able to take advantage of the momentum of a counterattack to retake a large stock of the initial, locations that were occupied beforehand. And so now we're seeing a lot of reinforcements come in order to just beef up the ranks and assist with, before the end of the year, finishing up some of these key battles over here. We look at most obviously the Cauldron in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, but there's Seversk, there's Kupyansk, there's I suppose Liman itself. You could look at Konstantinivka to a certain degree. So these are all areas that the Russians place some of the highest priority. So let's look at some of the new movements of forces, because we already looked at the 40th, the 155th, the 11th Air Assault Brigade, and then the 117th Naval Infantry Regiment. So over here, we're receiving information that from Kherson to Bakhmut, a lot of key units have been redeployed. So this includes the 28th, 26th, and 24th Motor Rifle Regiments, all a part of the same division, the 70th Motor Rifle Division. And then in addition, the 17th Tank Regiment, same thing from the 17th Division. And so it appears as if that division is being completely cannibalized, or at least significantly so, meaning that a lot of the initial garrison that was guarding in Kherson is now just being stripped away because there are other considerations at this point in time. And so you already had the deployment of reserves from the 5th Combined Arms Army. Now you have as well integration of some of the 70th Motor Rifle Division, in addition to several other key units over here. And so just to zoom in, I want to look yet again at what's going on over here, just to the north of Alexander Sholtuna. You can see that the Russians are able to capture nearly 40 hectares of territory. So just gradual advances in this particular location as the Russian side gets closer and closer to these dachas over here. There were some reports from the Ukrainian side that there was a Russian infiltration attempt, perhaps with the intention of severing control and isolating this pocket over here, which includes a lot of forested areas and perhaps some unseen trenches. And so now there is the possibility, at least due to the recent movement of American, or not, I don't know why I said American, Ukrainian forces, sorry, in this particular location, or Russian forces, I don't know. They are very active around here. They're being spotted by Ukrainian drones, and for the most part, the ones that are conducting these sort of forward vanguard operations and scouting of the front line, trying to arrive first in a certain location, substantially increases the cases of drones spotting them and striking them in due course. But in any case, I'm just saying that this region over here is weakened, and there is a large possibility of full-blown withdrawal due to the possibility of this region being just completely encircled and being chewed up and swallowed. So that's another piece of the puzzle just to the east of Konstantinivka. We're gonna try to go through these fast to finish up the video because if you can tell, I'm extremely tired. Serebryanka, Russian forces control, or rather don't control it. The Ukrainians do. The 7th Motor Rifle Brigade conducted FPV strikes onto houses over here in western Serebryanka, and that's a Russian unit, so they are already striking some of these Ukrainian points that have been retaken back within the town of Serebranka. And yeah, it should say in eastern Serebranka, if I'm not mistaken. But in any case, what this means is that there's now going to be slightly less onus on the Ukrainians to rapidly withdraw from the whatever remains of the Serebryansky forest. But at this point, due to how concentrated it is and due to how close of a connection there is across the border, it's slightly less of an issue. In any case, though, I want to move up over here to the situation that's developing with over here, the region to the south of Orikhiv. So over here, the Russians were able to capture 1.34 square kilometers of territory, and this is from August 27th. The 10th Army Corps conducted FPV strikes onto a Russian arms depot in this forested patch north of Brivska Andrivka, and so that high yield explosive, it is consistent with some level of, explosive materials as well inside. And so, that would indicate to us that there is this advance, not at any sort of significant pace, although some of the deep state updates over here actually have shown that there's more Russian territory captured than my own depiction of the situation. You could see over here that the distance between, for instance, the line of contact to over here to the Oskar River, but nonetheless, it's only about 9 kilometers, 10 kilometers away. And so, just to go back to Liman for a moment, because I did miss this, but you can see over here that the Russian side has been able to advance to the south directly south of Zelena Dolina, and in the process, they're continuing to take away a large chunk of the open fields over here in the pursuit of crossing over the Dragon's Teeth and Anytang Ditch, and then from there arriving at what is this over here? Vulitsia Huchenka. So this road over here that runs all the way to Drobisheva and then from there to Liman. So the basis for the movement is already beginning to form because you could already see how there's activity on the over here, the eastern flank, and there's also level of activity over here, slightly to the north. So certainly interesting. Now, I just want to show you guys 11 square kilometers of territory. It's extreme amount, especially for, the levels of defensive density along other parts of the front line. Over here, though, I want to zoom in on the area to the east of the Oskar River. There was a slight positional advance by the Russian side in between Kislivka and Tabaivka, so about 3.14 square kilometers of territory captured, just in an outstretched pocket where it was no longer feasible for the Ukrainians to continue holding out within some of those tree lines. And then Kupyansk, just to clarify the situation, you can see over here that I'm just being generous. I'm going to mark 0.7 or 972 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russian side. So the Russians sent in DRGs, and that has its own significance on a tactical level because it could disrupt communication, cause chaos internally, and then be used as an outlet for ambushes. So in this case, the Russian side is sending in DRGs to raise their flags in order to present it as evidence that they are in control over much larger swaths of the city than previously imagined. But as you can see over here with the videos, in the course of the videos from August 3rd, Russian flags did raise, or Russian DRGs rather did raise Russian flags within 4 locations in western Kupyansk. And so this would be one location, which is in the north. There's another one near the Spartak Stadium, and you can see it marked over here. And there are 2 other locations, which you can see on the map over here. One rather close to the Oskar River itself, and then one near the northwestern outskirts. So some of them may have been due to those ERGs. Others may be simply due to the fact that there actually was a Russian advance, and I would say that's most likely the case for the flag raising incidents that occurred near the government building over here, near the pizza restaurant, or any of the other private residential areas, which is why I've adjusted the map to reflect that fact. And in terms of the maximum advance moving southwards, it's about 800 meters in that southern direction. So the Russians are currently in the process of just creating the proper perimeter for storming of western Kupiansk, but the insinuation that there has been an ability by regular Russian forces, not just some very small level of DRGs, to arrive at the Spartak Stadium, to arrive at locations that are extremely outstretched within the center of western Kupiansk. That's all already beyond the pale, and it's not true for now. The Ukrainians, for the most part, are remaining situated within these apartment complexes, basements, and such within western Kupiansk over here. And so you can already see how the preparations are being made for the eventual storming of the western chunk of this town. And just to finish off, I do want to say that in relation to the 70th Division that is moving in its forces from the Kherson region all the way to Bakhmut now, we are seeing that a lot of them contain tanks with camouflage netting and cope cages on top. You have MCLBs, excavators, and trucks moving everything. And so there certainly is a significant movement. And 2 years ago, I estimated the Kherson garrison had about 35,000 people for the Russian side, moving an entire division away, and all the individual rifle regiments as well. That could add up to 15 million easily. So it would be down to 20,000, for instance. And regarding the Orikhiv sector, there were 2 vectors of assault for the Russian side, especially in this area in the direction of Novoselivka. So one starting from Kopani and then branching out along this highway to Novoselivka, and then one just exclusively starting in Robotyne and then advancing along the nearby fields or just connecting to highway over here. Either way, when you look at the activity of the forces over here from the 65th Mechanized Brigade and specifically the Ronin drone group, they claim that they were able to destroy 8 vehicles, inflict 70 casualties on the Russian side. Again, casualties being a vague word, could be killed or wounded. So out of the 8 vehicles, 4 of them were MTLBs, and they were on the Kopani over here, Novoselivka routes. You can see that pretty clearly over here that this is a particular route that's pretty common for these sort of assaults, especially due to the presence of the highway over here. And then 1 tank and 3 armored personnel carriers were destroyed between the course of filming this and publishing this, talking specifically about the publication of this assault, which probably occurred due to efforts from the 291st Motor Rifle Regiment, and the 3rd company of that regiment is operating a bit to the east with the situation developing in Malo, Tokmachka. But in any case, just due to the course of the advances by the armored vehicles, the fact that they were not stopped before they even crossed over the line of contact, which is in spite of some of the incidents occurring with the Ivan Franko group in the 79th Brigade, where they directed HIMARS strikes in the direction of the Russian columns. But over here, you can see an advance of 3.6 kilometers moving in northwards. And so, and at the same time, you see that there is this capture of territory amounting to 0.8 square kilometers. And this is also in an area that's relatively open. There is some density when it comes to defenses over here, but it is a bit scattered because certain locations were not really relevant during the building of these defenses, perhaps 2.5 years ago. Now over here with Malo, you can see over here that the Ukrainians took back 36 hectares of territory over, and so for now the battles continue raging on in the eastern chunk of the village, but the Russians have been able to change the dynamics over here by at least having a basis, or at least having some sort of linchpin that they can then be expanded depending on the course of the battles over there. But yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm so fatigued. Like, I was literally still right now, half asleep, half awake. So like imagining things, and I don't even want to like say something out loud that I'm imagining that's not relevant to the video. So that's why sometimes I just like sound completely out of it. But thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.